Something major is unfolding right now around XRP. And if you think this case is already over, you might be missing the most critical phase yet, because the battle between Ripple Labs and the US Securities and Exchange Commission is entering what many are calling the final stage. And this stage could decide not only the future of XRP, but also how the entire crypto market is regulated going forward, which means this is not just another update, but a turning point that could impact prices, investor confidence, and even the legal status of digital assets worldwide. So if you are holding XRP or even just watching the crypto space, you need to understand exactly what is happening right now and why this moment is more important than anything we have seen before. Right now, the situation between XRP and the US Securities and Exchange Commission is reaching a stage where every small development is being closely watched by investors, analysts, and even regulators across the world. Because this case has never been just about one cryptocurrency. Instead, it has always been about defining the rules of the entire crypto industry. And that is exactly why this so called final phase is creating so much attention and tension at the same time. To understand why this moment matters so much, you need to remember how this case started when the SEC accused Ripple Labs of selling XRP as an unregistered security, which immediately created fear in the market, because if XRP was officially labeled as a security, it could have set a precedent for many other cryptocurrencies to face similar action. And that would have completely changed how crypto projects operate, especially in the United States, which remains one of the most important financial markets in the world. As the case moved forward over the years, there were several key rulings that gave partial clarity but never a complete conclusion. And one of the biggest turning points came when the court suggested that XRP itself is not necessarily a security in all situations, especially when traded on exchanges by regular investors, which gave a massive boost of confidence to the XRP community and led to a strong reaction in the market. But even after that decision, the case did not fully end because there were still unresolved issues, penalties, and legal interpretations that needed to be finalized. Now, what makes this phase different is that both sides are no longer arguing about basic definitions only. Instead, they are moving toward final outcomes such as potential settlements, penalties, or even long term regulatory implications. And this is where things get very serious, because the final decisions made here could define how companies raise funds using digital assets and how regulators approach crypto enforcement in the future. At the same time, there are increasing discussions about whether this case might end in a settlement rather than a prolonged legal battle, because settlements can sometimes benefit both sides by reducing uncertainty and avoiding further delays. But that also depends on how strong each side believes their position is. And based on recent developments, it appears that Ripple Labs has gained some leverage due to earlier rulings, which could influence how negotiations move forward. Another important factor that cannot be ignored is the broader impact this case has on the crypto market as a whole, because investors are not just reacting to XRP news, they are also trying to predict how regulators will treat other tokens. And that is why every update in this case often leads to movement, not just in XRP price, but across multiple cryptocurrencies, showing how deeply connected this legal battle has become with overall market sentiment. In addition, global regulators are also watching this case very carefully, because the outcome could influence regulatory frameworks in other countries, especially those that are still developing their own crypto laws. And if the final phase results in clear guidelines, it could actually bring more stability to the market. But if it ends with more uncertainty, it might slow down innovation and adoption in the short term. This is exactly why many experts are calling this moment the final phase, because it is no longer about small arguments or procedural delays. Instead, it is about reaching a conclusion that has been building for years. And whether that conclusion comes through a court ruling or a settlement, One thing is clear, that the outcome will have long lasting effects, not just for XRP holders, but for the entire crypto industry moving forward. As this case moves deeper into what many are calling the final phase, the focus is now shifting toward the possible outcomes. And this is where things become even more important for anyone following XRP, because the end result will not just close a legal battle, but could reshape how digital assets are treated in the real financial world, especially in relation to regulation, compliance, and investor protection. One of the biggest questions right now is whether this case will end with a final court judgment or a negotiated settlement between Ripple Labs and the US Securities and Exchange Commission. And both possibilities carry very different implications, because a court ruling would create a stronger legal precedent, while a settlement might resolve the dispute faster but leave some questions partially unanswered, which means the crypto market is watching both scenarios very carefully. If we look at the settlement angle first, it is important to understand that settlements often happen when both parties see value in avoiding further risk, time, and cost. And in this case, there are strong reasons why a settlement could be considered, because the legal process has already taken years, and continuing the fight could extend uncertainty even longer, which is something neither side may want at this stage, especially when the market is evolving quickly and new regulatory challenges are emerging globally. At the same time, Ripple Labs might feel more confident going into this phase because of earlier rulings that did not fully support the SEC's original claims, particularly around how XRP is traded in the open market. And this confidence could influence their willingness to negotiate from a stronger position, which in simple terms means they may not accept a settlement unless it clearly benefits them and protects the future use of XRP. On the other hand, the US Securities and Exchange Commission also has its own priorities, because this case is not just about one company. Instead, it is part of a larger effort to establish authority over the crypto space. And if the SEC pushes for a strong final outcome, it could send a message to other crypto projects about compliance and legal responsibility, which is why their approach in this final phase will be extremely strategic. Now, if the case moves toward a final court decision instead of a settlement, the impact could be even bigger, because a clear judgment would set a legal standard that could be used in future cases involving cryptocurrencies. And this is where things become very serious, because it could influence how tokens are classified, how exchanges operate, and even how investors interact with digital assets in regulated markets. Another key element that is being discussed right now is the possibility of penalties or fines, because even if XRP itself is not fully classified as a security in all contexts, there could still be consequences related to past actions. And this is something that both sides are likely negotiating behind the scenes, because financial penalties could play a major role in how this case is ultimately resolved. At the same time, market participants are trying to read every signal coming from this case, because even small updates can create strong reactions in the price of XRP. And this shows how sensitive the market is to legal clarity, which is why this final phase is not just a legal process, but also a psychological moment for investors who are trying to decide whether to hold, buy, or exit their positions. In addition, this case is also influencing how institutional investors view the crypto space, because large financial players often wait for regulatory clarity before making significant moves. And if this case provides that clarity, it could open the door for more institutional involvement, which would be a major shift for XRP and the broader crypto market. All of this is building toward a conclusion that has the potential to define the next chapter of crypto regulation. And whether it ends in a settlement or a final ruling, the outcome will likely shape not just the future of XRP, but also the direction of the entire industry in ways that we are only beginning to understand right now. At this stage of the case, one of the most important things to understand is how the outcome could directly impact the future price and adoption of XRP, because beyond the legal arguments and courtroom strategies, The real question for most people is what happens next in the market and whether this final phase will act as a catalyst for growth or create new uncertainty that slows things down. Right now, many analysts believe that if Ripple Labs comes out of this phase with a favorable resolution, whether through a strong court ruling or a balanced settlement, it could remove one of the biggest barriers that has been holding XRP back for years. And that barrier is regulatory uncertainty, which has made some exchanges cautious and has limited institutional participation, despite the strong technology behind XRP and its use case in cross border payments. When uncertainty is removed from any asset, especially in the crypto market, it often leads to increased confidence among investors because people prefer clarity over speculation. And in the case of XRP, clarity could encourage more platforms to fully support it again, which in turn could increase liquidity and trading volume. And these factors are directly connected to price movement over time, making this final phase extremely important from an investment perspective. At the same time, there is also a strong narrative developing around the idea that XRP could benefit from being one of the few cryptocurrencies that has gone through such an intense legal review. Because if it emerges with a clearer status compared to other tokens, it might actually gain a competitive advantage in the market, especially in regions where regulatory compliance is becoming stricter and more important for long term growth. However, it is also important to look at the other side of the situation because if the outcome introduces new restrictions or financial penalties that limit how Ripple Labs can operate, it could create short term pressure on XRP, particularly if investors react emotionally to headlines without fully understanding the details. And this is something that has happened multiple times throughout this case where price movements were driven more by perception than actual long term impact. Another factor that cannot be ignored is the role of institutional investors because large financial institutions often avoid assets that are surrounded by legal uncertainty. And this case has been one of the main reasons why XRP has not seen the same level of institutional adoption as some other major cryptocurrencies. But if this final phase provides a clear and positive resolution, it could change that situation and open the door for bigger players to enter the market. In addition, partnerships and real world use cases could also expand if the legal situation becomes clearer because companies that were previously hesitant to work with XRP due to regulatory concerns might reconsider their position, especially in areas like international payments where XRP has always been positioned as a fast and cost effective solution. And this could lead to increased adoption beyond just trading and speculation. At the same time, the broader crypto market is also watching closely because the outcome of this case could influence how other projects are evaluated by regulators. And if XRP is seen as having achieved a level of legal clarity, it might set an example that other projects try to follow, which could indirectly strengthen XRP's position in the industry. It is also worth noting that market expectations are already playing a role in current price behavior because many traders are positioning themselves based on what they believe will happen next. And this creates a situation where the actual outcome could either confirm expectations and drive momentum or surprise the market and cause sudden volatility, depending on how the final decision compares to what people are anticipating right now. All of these factors are coming together in this final phase, making it one of the most critical moments in the history of XRP because it is not just about ending a legal case, it is about unlocking potential, defining limitations, and setting the direction for what comes next in both price action and real world adoption, which is exactly why so many people are paying close attention to every update coming out of this situation. As this situation moves closer to a conclusion, Another critical aspect that needs attention is the long term regulatory impact of this case, because what happens between Ripple Labs and the US Securities and Exchange Commission will not stay limited to one company or one cryptocurrency. Instead, it has the potential to influence how governments and financial authorities around the world approach the entire digital asset space. And that is why this final phase is being observed far beyond just the XRP community. Right now, regulators in different countries are trying to build their own frameworks for crypto, but many of them are still in the early stages where rules are not fully defined. And in such a situation, a high profile case like this becomes extremely important because it provides a real world example of how digital assets can be analyzed from a legal perspective, especially when it comes to determining whether a token should be treated as a security, a commodity, or something entirely different. If the outcome of this case provides clear reasoning and strong legal arguments, it could act as a reference point for future regulations. And this is where XRP could play a much bigger role than most people expect, because instead of being seen only as a cryptocurrency, it could become part of a larger legal framework that helps define the rules for the entire industry, which would be a major shift from how it has been viewed during the early years of this case. At the same time, this case is also highlighting the ongoing tension between innovation and regulation, because on one side, companies like Ripple Labs are trying to develop new financial technologies that can improve global payments and efficiency, while on the other side, regulatory bodies like the US Securities and Exchange Commission are focused on protecting investors and maintaining order in financial markets. And finding a balance between these two goals is one of the biggest challenges in the crypto space today. This is exactly why the final phase is so important, because it could show whether it is possible to reach a middle ground where innovation is allowed to grow while still meeting regulatory requirements. And if such a balance is achieved, it could encourage more companies to enter the crypto space with confidence, knowing that there are clear rules to follow instead of uncertainty that could lead to legal challenges later on. Another important element in this discussion is how this case might influence future enforcement actions, because if the SEC achieves a strong outcome, it could become more aggressive in pursuing other crypto projects. But if the result favors Ripple Labs or limits the SEC's claims, it could force regulators to rethink their strategies and possibly move toward clearer guidelines instead of relying heavily on enforcement actions to shape the market. In addition, lawmakers and policymakers are also paying attention, because cases like this often highlight gaps in existing laws. And when those gaps become visible, it increases the chances of new legislation being introduced to address them, which means the final outcome of this case could indirectly lead to new crypto laws in the future, not just in the United States, but in other regions as well. At the same time, the global crypto community is reacting to this case as a signal of how serious regulatory risks can be. And this awareness is pushing projects to become more transparent and compliant from the beginning, which could improve the overall quality and trustworthiness of the industry over time, even though it may slow down some aspects of rapid innovation in the short term. All of these developments show that this is not just a legal battle that is about to end. It is a defining moment that could shape how crypto evolves in the coming years. And whether the outcome creates clarity or leaves certain questions unanswered, one thing is certain: that the effects will be felt far beyond just XRP, making this final phase one of the most important periods in the history of digital assets. As everything now builds toward a final outcome, the most important thing for anyone following XRP is to understand how to approach this moment with the right mindset. Because while this phase is being described as the end of a long legal battle, it is also the beginning of a new phase that could bring both opportunities and risks, depending on how the situation unfolds in the coming weeks or months. At this point, expectations in the market are extremely high. And whenever expectations reach this level, there is always a possibility of strong reactions in either direction. Because if the outcome matches what investors are hoping for, it can lead to a surge in confidence and momentum. But if there is any kind of unexpected development, it can create sudden volatility that catches many people off guard. And this is something that has been seen multiple times during the legal journey of Ripple Labs and the US Securities and Exchange Commission. One key point to keep in mind is that even after a final decision or settlement, the impact may not be immediate in a straight line because markets often take time to fully process major developments. And in some cases, initial reactions can be emotional rather than logical, which means short term price movements do not always reflect the long term reality. And this is why patience and understanding are very important during such moments. At the same time, it is also important to recognize that this case has already changed the way people look at crypto because it has shown that regulatory challenges are real and can have a long lasting impact on projects. But it has also demonstrated that companies are willing to fight for clarity and push back against uncertainty, which could lead to a more mature and structured industry in the future. For XRP specifically, this final phase could act as a reset point because once the legal uncertainty is reduced or removed, the focus can shift back to its real world use case, technology, and adoption, which are the factors that ultimately drive long term value rather than just legal headlines. And this shift in focus could play a major role in shaping how XRP is positioned in the market going forward. In addition, the broader crypto market will also be influenced by how this situation concludes because other projects, investors, and even regulators will use this case as a reference when making decisions. And this means the outcome could indirectly affect the direction of the entire industry, making it one of the most important events to watch, even for those who are not directly involved with XRP. Another important aspect to consider is how information spreads during such high profile events, because in today's digital environment, news travels fast and sometimes gets mixed with speculation, which is why it becomes very important to focus on verified updates rather than reacting to every headline or rumor, especially when financial decisions are involved. As this final phase comes closer to its conclusion, the best approach is to stay informed, stay patient, and understand that major developments like this often create both opportunities and challenges at the same time. And those who are able to remain calm and make decisions based on clear information rather than emotion are usually in a better position to navigate such situations effectively. This entire journey between Ripple Labs and the US Securities and Exchange Commission has been one of the most closely followed legal battles in the history of crypto. And now, as it approaches its final phase, it is setting the stage for what could be a defining moment, not just for XRP, but for the entire digital asset ecosystem moving forward. Before ending, it is important to mention that this content is only for informational purposes and should not be considered financial advice because the crypto market is highly volatile and involves risk. So always do your own research before making any investment decisions. And if you want to stay updated with the latest developments around XRP and the crypto market, make sure to subscribe and stay connected for future updates.